His deformed hands shocked the sideshow circus, but at home he used his claws to make love and murder innocent people. This circus freak turned out to be a real monster. Prepare yourself for the horrifying tale of Satan itself, the Lobster Boy, a story so shocking that it will make your jaw drop at every turn. Are you ready to make your skin crawl and your blood run cold? Let's infiltrate the family of this monstrous figure. Was he born this way, or was he shaped by the cruelty of his environment? The Stiles family's entry into the circus world was not by chance, but by necessity. For Grady Stiles Sr., the idea of being a freak was never a source of shame, but an opportunity for survival. Born with a similar condition, he made his peace with the deformity early in life. His world was one where deformities were used to create a spectacle, and he found strength in embracing his unique physicality. But as much as Grady Sr. accepted his fate, he pushed his son, Grady Jr., into the same mold, encouraging him to take pride in being part of a legacy that had given the family financial stability, albeit at the cost of their humanity. Grady Sr.'s perspective on their family's involvement in the circus was pragmatic. It was not a choice, it was survival. He didn't see the cruelty behind the exploitation of the human curiosities, as he viewed their role as a way to gain wealth and fame. The circus was a family business, and its success was built on the commodification of physical differences. But while Grady Sr. justified the circus as an economic necessity, Grady Jr. felt the emotional toll that his father could not see. To him, being in the circus was a prison, a place where the outside world couldn't accept him for who he was, and where his worth was reduced to his deformity. From the outside, the Stiles family was a success story. The circus paid well, and Grady Jr. was a star attraction, but behind the scenes, there was a constant tension in the household as young Grady struggled to find his own identity in a world that reduced him to his physical condition. His self-worth was inextricably tied to the attention he received for his deformity, but he wanted to be loved and accepted for who he was inside. Yet in the circus, that was impossible. This was the beginning of the transformation to a heartless person. But next up, we will give a closer look at how he was treated like a freak in the circus. Grady's formative years were spent in the glaring spotlight of the circus, but it wasn't the type of attention that young children crave. The constant applause was not for his abilities as a person, but rather for the novelty of his condition. Though he performed for appreciative audiences, the applause felt like a form of pity, not admiration. He began to resent the world for seeing him only as a curiosity. And as he grew older, this resentment became more difficult to manage. When he was young, Grady tried to understand why he was different, why people stared at him, and why his deformity made him so special to others. His father, who had been similarly affected by the circus, believed it was a gift that could be used to their advantage. But to Grady, the world was cruel, and his father's insistence that he embrace his role in the sideshow felt suffocating. As Grady entered his teenage years, he became acutely aware that his deformity was not something he could escape. He was stuck in a life that revolved around his body, not his mind or heart. Grady struggled with the juxtaposition of the image people had of him and the internal self-doubt that was eating away at his sense of identity. The rift between his internal world and the external one became increasingly unmanageable. The circus provided him with financial rewards, but it also created deep emotional wounds that would never heal. It was during these early years that Grady started to develop a profound sense of anger and frustration. He began to feel betrayed by his body and by the world around him. Let's witness this specific moment when the violence began to show through his claws. As Grady Jr. entered adulthood, the circus world was undergoing a significant transformation. The sideshow was no longer the grand spectacle it had once been. The public's fascination with freaks began to wane as new forms of entertainment, television, cinema, and later the internet became the dominant forms of popular culture. What had once been celebrated as eccentric was now seen as strange or even grotesque. Despite this, Grady's act remained one of the most iconic in the circus, yet it was clear that the appeal of sideshow performances was slowly fading. Grady began to realize that his body, once revered, had become a relic in a dying industry. The applause that had once been so validating now felt increasingly hollow. He no longer felt like the star attraction, but a museum piece, a living curiosity for people to gawk at, rather than someone capable of real connection or achievement. He had been branded a freak, not for his unique talents, but for the physical condition he had been born with. It seemed as though no matter how much he performed or how well he entertained, the audience saw him only as the Lobster Boy, the deformed man, not the person underneath. This realization stung deeply. What had been a source of pride for him as a child had now become a prison, and Grady found himself questioning whether there was any way out. His entire life had been defined by his deformity. And now that he was no longer the young, innocent sideshow act, it seemed like he would be stuck in this role forever. It was as though the world had stopped seeing him as a human being with dreams and aspirations, and instead only saw his physical appearance, the one thing he could never escape. As Grady looked at the crowds that gathered around him in the circus tent, he began to feel as though they were not seeing the man he had become, but the boy he had once been. The applause no longer felt like acknowledgement of his worth as a person. Grady had never asked for the life he had been given. His deformity was not something he had chosen, and yet it had become the lens through which the world viewed him. The circus was a double-edged sword. It gave him fame, money, and a form of recognition he could never have dreamed of as a child. But it also trapped him in a role he could not escape, a role that caused him to question his self-worth and to wonder what his life might have been like had he been born a normal person. As the circus began to transition away from its old-fashioned style, Grady felt increasingly isolated. His family, too, had become caught in this trap, with no way to free themselves from the web of expectations that the circus had woven around them. His wife, Barbara, had been supportive, but even she could not truly understand the toll this life was taking on Grady's psyche. She had been born into the circus world, just as he had, and while she loved him, her understanding of his internal struggles was limited by her acceptance of their world. Grady's anger grew, fueled by feelings of being trapped. Every day he performed the same routines, wore the same costume, and interacted with the same audience, all while feeling more and more detached from the world outside the circus. He had become a cog in a machine he could no longer understand, and the more he struggled to break free, the tighter the grip of the circus world seemed to become. It was as though he was not allowed to be anything more than what the circus had made him, and he began to wonder if he would ever be free. Grady's marriage to Barbara was a search for normalcy, a desperate attempt to find something outside of the circus that could give him a sense of peace. Barbara, though not suffering from the same deformities, was born into a similar life. She, too, had been raised in the circus environment, and the two found comfort in each other's shared experience. Yet, this bond, built on mutual understanding, was never enough to fill the deep emotional void within Grady. Barbara, despite her deformity, was more content with her place in the circus world than Grady ever was. She had grown up in it and learned to accept it as her reality. Grady, on the other hand, could never escape the nagging feeling that he was more than just his deformity, that he had more to offer the world. But the circus, with its constant demand for performance, constantly reminded him that his value was determined by his physical appearance. At first, the marriage seemed like an escape for Grady. With Barbara, he was able to create a family, and in some ways, this filled him with a sense of hope. But as time went on, the cracks in their relationship began to show. The strain of their life in the circus, coupled with Grady's emotional turmoil, made their relationship increasingly difficult. Grady's resentment turned inward, then outward, as his need to control his surroundings grew stronger. The once promising foundation of their marriage, built on love and mutual understanding, became a battlefield of emotional neglect and violent outbursts. Grady's growing anger and frustration with his life began to manifest in violent outbursts. The combination of alcohol, suppressed rage, and emotional trauma had pushed him to the brink. The violence, once an occasional outburst, became a regular pattern of behavior. He turned on those closest to him, including Barbara and their children. His outbursts of violence were often triggered by the smallest of things: perceived disrespect, small arguments, or even nothing at all. The rage that had been building for years found an outlet in physical violence. Barbara, who had initially been hopeful that their life together might be peaceful, became terrified. She tried to intervene, but Grady's rage had reached a point where reason no longer seemed to work. Grady's addiction to alcohol only worsened his temper, and the emotional toll of living in fear took a heavy toll on Barbara's mental health. Grady's children, too, were caught in the middle of this volatile environment. They had grown up in a world that had promised them stability through their connection to the circus. Yet what they saw in their home was chaos, fear, and anger. They, too, began to internalize the violence, each in their own way. Grady's son, in particular, was deeply affected by the trauma of living under his father's oppressive rule. November 29, 1992, was a fateful day for Grady Stiles Jr. His emotional unraveling had reached its zenith. The years of alcoholism, violence, and neglect had eroded whatever was left of his humanity. He and Barbara had been arguing for hours about money, about the kids, about the life they had built. In the haze of alcohol and rage, Grady snapped. With the ease of someone who had done it before, he retrieved a gun and shot Barbara. The act, though premeditated, seemed almost like an inevitability. The years of emotional torment, the helplessness he felt in his own life, and the resentment he harbored for the world culminated in a brutal act of violence. Grady's mind at that moment had been so distorted by alcohol and rage that he saw the murder not as a crime, but as a release, a form of control. Grady's arrest was swift, but the psychological effects of his crime lingered long after. The circus world, which had once celebrated his uniqueness, now recoiled at his actions. The man who had once been a beloved attraction was now a convicted murderer. The public's perception of Grady was forever changed. He went from being a man who was famous for his deformity to a man infamous for his horrific crime. The trial was a public spectacle. The world watched as Grady's tragic tale unfolded, with his past in the circus, his alcoholism, and his history of violence all laid bare. The emotional devastation felt by his children and family was apparent to everyone in the courtroom. In the end, Grady was convicted of first-degree murder, and the sentence was a life behind bars. Grady spent his final years in prison, a place that was eerily similar to the circus. He was isolated, removed from the world, and left to confront the consequences of his actions. In prison, he found no redemption, no second chances, only the oppressive weight of his decisions. Grady's health declined rapidly as he struggled with his alcoholism and mental health, and he died in prison, far from the stage where he had once been celebrated. The legacy of Grady Stiles Jr. is a tragic one. From a beloved sideshow act to a convicted murderer, his life serves as a grim reminder of the destructive effects of unresolved emotional trauma, addiction, and violence. His death in prison, a quiet end to a life defined by chaos and destruction, was the final act in a story that had begun long before the world knew his name. In the end, Grady's story is not just one of violence, but of a man who was never allowed to be anything other than a spectacle, a freak in a world that never understood him. And in the absence of understanding, Grady found nothing but anger, resentment, and the eventual unraveling of his own humanity. Grady's trial was a media frenzy. The man who had once been the star attraction of a traveling circus was now in a courtroom, accused of murder. The public was captivated by the case. The defense argued that Grady had been suffering from diminished capacity due to his alcoholism, while the prosecution painted him as a cold-blooded murderer. Throughout the trial, Grady remained silent, his emotions hidden behind a stoic expression. He had lost everything: his family, his reputation, and his sense of self. He was convicted of murder, and the circus world, which had once embraced him, now turned its back on him forever. Grady was sentenced to 27 years in prison for the murder of his wife. His life, which had once been full of applause and attention, was now marked by disgrace and isolation. He would never again perform in front of a crowd, and the fame that had once defined him was now a distant memory. Grady's time in prison was marked by reflection and regret. He had lost everything that mattered: his family, his reputation, and his freedom. And in the quiet moments of his imprisonment, he could not escape the reality of what he had done. Grady's prison life was a stark contrast to the one he had known as a circus performer. He was no longer the center of attention, no longer a spectacle. He was a convicted murderer, just another inmate in a cold and unforgiving system. His life had gone from being one of fame to one of anonymity. The world had moved on, and Grady found himself completely alone. But despite the solitude of his prison existence, Grady was still haunted by the demons of his past. The alcohol had destroyed his relationship, his family, and ultimately his life. Now, behind bars, Grady was left to confront the reality of his actions. As the years passed, Grady remained in prison, his body aging and his mind growing weary. He often reflected on his life and the choices he had made. His legacy, once tied to the circus, and the fame that had come with his deformity, had been forever tarnished by his crime. He was no longer remembered for his time in the circus. He was remembered for the murder he had committed. Grady's children, now adults, had to live with the knowledge that their father was a murderer. They tried to move on with their lives, but the shadow of Grady's actions loomed over them. The family had been forever scarred, not by the deformities that ran in their blood, but by the violence that had consumed their father. As Grady aged, his health deteriorated in prison. He had spent his life drinking and abusing his body, and now those choices caught up with him. His time in prison was spent in reflection, but it was also marked by the physical toll of his past decisions. Grady's legacy was a tragic one. He had lived a life full of potential, but his own anger and bitterness had led him down a path of destruction. He had been given a chance to be something more than the Lobster Boy, but he had never taken it. Instead, he had let his demons consume him. In 1992, Grady Stiles Jr. died in prison, a man broken by his past and his actions. The circus world, once so familiar to him, had long since moved on. His name was no longer a symbol of entertainment. It was a reminder of the darkness that can exist within the human soul. Grady's death marked the end of his tragic story. The world had forgotten the Lobster Boy and remembered only the murderer. But for those who had known him, the story of Grady Stiles Jr. was a painful reminder of what can happen when someone is trapped in their own identity, unable to break free from the shadows of their past. Grady Stiles Jr.'s life and crime left a mark on the circus world. Once a place of wonder, it became a symbol of exploitation and tragedy. The public's fascination with freaks and the darker side of humanity was no longer something to be celebrated. It had become something to fear. Many in the circus industry were forced to confront the moral implications of exploiting individuals like Grady for profit. Grady's life was a cautionary tale of how the circus world could take everything from a person, including their humanity, and turn them into a commodity. The legacy of Grady Stiles Jr.'s crime is still remembered today. His life is a reminder of the dangers of exploitation, the consequences of untreated emotional trauma, and the devastation that can come from a violent outburst. Grady's story serves as a reflection on the cost of fame, the role of identity in shaping our lives, and the tragic impact that violence and abuse can have on families. Grady's story may have ended, but the story of his family did not. His children, now adults, had to live with the consequences of their father's actions. The cycle of violence and emotional abuse that began with Grady's birth continued to affect future generations. The legacy of Grady Stiles Jr. serves as a powerful reminder of how the past shapes the present and how the consequences of our actions ripple out to affect those around us. The circus world, too, continues to be marked by its history of exploitation and the people whose lives were shaped by the bright lights and dark shadows of the stage. The story of Grady Stiles Jr. is a cautionary tale about the perils of living a life defined by what others see rather than by who we are.